In his opening lines, Paul shares some truths about calling, about his own sense of calling. And this sense of calling is something that might well serve to guide you, graduates, and guide all of us as we leave here today. So when we turn to the text that Connor read in Romans chapter 1, the first thing that we see about Paul's calling is that Paul's call was not about Paul. Paul introduces his letter to Romans the way that he typically introduces letters. He identifies himself according to the conventions of his day, and then he describes himself. He's a slave. He's called. He's an apostle set apart. Significantly, Paul sees his calling somewhere between his status and his function. His status, Paul says he is a slave. The translation said servant, but that's too weak. In Paul's day, the word was slave, and it meant slave. And in Paul's day, slaves were part of the everyday economy. In Paul's world, a slave had absolutely no status, no power, no rights. And Paul starts his letter by saying, I am a slave of Jesus Christ. And then he talks about his function, an apostle, an emissary. And he says, I'm an emissary, specifically one set apart is the word. Set apart, holy, consecrated. This is the holiness language of Leviticus, the language of devotion, like those items that get dedicated in the temple of Israel's God. These are not the common objects of everyday use, not the things for ourselves, but set apart for God. And Paul then reveals that the purpose of his call to be God's emissary, the reason he is set apart, is for the gospel of God. Paul's call was nothing to do with Paul. Paul's call was to be totally devoted to God and God's purposes. God's purposes, Paul goes on, as rooted in the story of Jesus, the story told in the prophetic and the holy writings, Jesus' messianic lineage through David, his death, his resurrection from the dead, leading to the grace and repeating his role as an emissary. God's purposes were for the obedience of faith also among the Gentiles. Among the Gentiles. That tells us something else about Paul's call. Paul's call was not Paul's plan. We know a little bit of the history and biography of Paul, both the biography he describes about himself and also his biographer Luke tells us. We know he studied as a Pharisee. In his own words, he was zealous for the things of God, faithfully bringing the ways of God, Israel's God, into this world. In stark contrast in his mind to the ways of those godless Gentiles. He was devoted. He had a plan until unexpectedly, unbidden, unwanted, God flipped the script on Paul. Now God tells him his purpose is the inclusion of those very Gentiles. Gentiles. In fact, this was God's plan all along. And Paul's purpose now is to show the Gentiles how to order their lives, how to become obedient in covenant relationship with Israel's God through the covenant formed by faith and the faithfulness of Jesus. And believe me, that is not why Paul went to Bible college or attended seminary. That was not the calling that Paul had as part of his plan. But Paul's call is not about Paul. Paul's call was to be totally devoted to God and God's purposes. And as a consequence of Paul's total devotion, something incredible happens. Paul's faithfulness to his call opened the way for others to be called to Jesus too. In verse 6, we see that those Gentiles who Paul had previously seen only in opposition to God, now being, like Paul himself, themselves also called to Jesus Christ. Again, Paul's call is not about Paul. Paul's call is for God, and through God and God's purposes, Paul's call is for others. And then we come to verse 7. And Paul continues his conventional letter writing style by identifying the recipients of his letter. To all of you in Rome, beloved of God, called to be holy. It might not seem on the surface, but this is a loaded statement. You see, all was not well in the church at Rome. There was tension there, division, factions, different groups having come together, jockeying for power and position. What we know from history is that at some point around AD 49, the Jews in Rome were expelled by the Emperor Claudius. And one ancient Roman historian tells us that the expulsion was blamed on Jewish infighting over a figure he called Christus, which we know as Christ. At all events, the Jews were kicked out of Rome for a period of 5 or 6 years until Claudius died, and the Jews were let back in. And that's the point at which our story with Romans takes place. Well, the Jews, and especially the Jewish followers of Jesus, had been away. The Roman church continued to operate. It continued to grow. But now, mostly composed of and led by the Gentiles. So when the Jews returned to Rome, the Jewish former leaders of the church found themselves out of a job and in tension and in conflict with the current Gentile administration and the now predominantly Gentile church. Enter Paul and his letter to the Romans. Here, Paul writes the Romans with the hope that somehow the Jewish and the Gentile followers of Jesus can get along. There's no difference in God's eyes, Paul will go on to say. He makes no distinction, Jew or Gentile. We are all slaves to sin, and we all are called to be slaves to God. And so we return here in verse 7 to these recipients in verse 7. In Paul's language, it doesn't always come through in our translation, but in his language, he is emphatic in declaring that this letter is addressed to all in the Roman congregation, both the Jews returning and the Gentiles now dominating the church. He declares that all are beloved of God, and mirroring his own call in the opening verses of this letter, he identifies all the Roman congregation as called to be holy. That is just like Paul's own call to be set apart. consecrated in total devotion to God's purposes. Paul calls the Romans to be holy, set apart, devoted to God's purposes. Like Paul, the Romans' call was not about the Romans. It was not about their preferences. It was not about their personal plans. So what are the implications of that as we watch graduates graduate today and go on to pursue God's calling? I hope the one implication that is clear is that your calling is not about you. Like Paul, like the Romans, whatever your preference is, whatever your plans are, when you graduate from here, Paul's opening lines to Romans reminds all of us to hold on to those things loosely. Be disposed like Paul. Recognize yourselves as beloved and as slaves and as consecrated and set apart, that God's purposes, which will be much bigger than anything you can imagine, will guide you through your own life and calling.